Okay,
Hi, Brant. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, thanks. How are you?
I am doing just fine, thank you. It's so good to see you and have you here, and I'm excited to talk to you today. I think this is a great topic that we're going to get into. So, for those of you that don't know, this is Dr. Brant Cortright, PhD. He is a professor emeritus with the California Institute of Integral Studies and a clinical psychologist with a private practice in San Francisco as well as online. He's the author of 4 books and has a practice as a coach and consultant on anxiety, depression, cognitive decline, and brain health. He gives workshops around the world and is a speaker at conferences on this topic. And among his publications is the number one Amazon bestseller, Holistic Healing for Anxiety, Depression, and Cognitive Decline. So, Brant, I think the topic that we're going to talk about today, holistic healing and mental health, is really relevant to this broader conversation on resilience, which is particularly relevant for the audience that I have through Live in Rebellion, where we support women to flip the script, mentally, physically, spiritually, and emotionally on adversity so that they can create opportunity for themselves and move forward. And certainly in the midst of major life transitions, mental health is an issue that can come up a lot. I'm sure we all likely know someone who is struggling with their mental health. How bad are these problems of anxiety, depression, and cognitive decline?
They are huge. Um, Probably many of the people listening to this not only know somebody who's struggling with it, but are probably struggling out with it themselves. And it disproportionately seems to affect women even more than men. Maybe because men don't report it as much, but certainly for some things, like Alzheimer's, for example, which is 5 times what it was 50 years ago, it seems to affect women twice as much as men. So 2/3 of Alzheimer's patients are women. Similar with depression. Something like 1/4 of American women between 25 and 45 are taking an antidepressant. And anxiety is an even bigger issue than depression. It's overtaken depression as the #1 mental disorder these days. And it affects the young even more than the middle-aged or the older ones. So for childhood rates of depression and in adolescence and in the 20s, the rates are 5 to 8 times for depression what they were in the 1960s. And for anxiety, they are 8 times what they were in the 1960s. And that's not with better testing. That's the same standardized tests used back then. Plus now we have ADD, ADHD, autism, all this stuff that wasn't even in existence or hardly in existence back then. So it seems like something in the environment has changed radically in the past 50 years. And my own sense, and that of many others, is that there are many more neurotoxins in our environment, particularly physical neurotoxins. Wikipedia lists 6,000 neurotoxins in the environment that were never there before. Some of these we know about, like mercury, very, very potent neurotoxin, second only to plutonium, I believe. Lead, arsenic, plastics. Pretty much everybody in America has measurable levels of microplastics, phthalates, these forever chemicals like Teflon. These are endocrine disruptors, which help cause cancer, create inflammation, and an endocrine disruptor wreaks havoc with our mood. Smog, they're really tiny particles in smog, 2.5 microns. They enter the lungs, enter the bloodstream, cross the blood-brain barrier, where they act like little wrecking balls in the brain. They have found amyloid plaque, the same amyloid plaque that we see in Alzheimer's disease, in 1-year-old babies in Mexico City, which is highly polluted with smog. They didn't think that 1-year-old babies could get amyloid plaque, but in a very polluted environment, they do. And one of the biggest ones is glyphosate, which is the biggest pesticide ever used on the planet. 300 million pounds are used every year in the United States. It's in the dust in the Midwest and in the South. It's in the rain, those areas. There's so much of it is being used. 93% of Americans have measurable levels of glyphosate, according to a UCSF study done a few years ago. Probably it's even more by now.
That's really concerning.
And what glyphosate does is it opens up the tight junctions of the intestines. And the tight junctions are what keep out the bad stuff and let in the good stuff. So when we open those up, all sorts of toxins come into the body, which creates inflammation. And inflammation, as we know, is behind all the major chronic diseases: cancer, cardiovascular disease, Alzheimer's, you name it. So not only do the tight junctions of the intestines open up with glyphosate, but the tight junctions of the blood-brain barrier also open up. Those tight junctions respond to the same molecular signaling molecules as that of the intestines. So we get leaky brain, where these toxins then come into the brain, creating inflammation, oxidation. So pretty much everybody, not everybody, but almost everybody in the Western Hemisphere, because these are throughout Latin America, throughout Brazil, glyphosate is used just everywhere these days, has some degree of leaky gut and leaky brain. And what these toxins do is they slow down the brain. They make the brain more sluggish, right? So people think of the brain as a computer, but it's a terrible analogy because a computer is a dead, static machine. And the brain is not static. The brain is living. The brain is moving. The brain is always in motion. Every new experience changes the brain. Listening to this is changing people's brains. So this movement of the brain, where it's making new connections and making new brain cells, processes called neuroplasticity and neurogenesis. This neurogenic rate, this rate at which the brain is moving, has a big impact on the quality of our consciousness, on how we feel, and our capacity for thinking as well. I'm going on and on here, but let me just say one more.
Sure.
So when they first discovered that neurogenesis occurs throughout the entire lifetime, after decades and decades of thinking our brain stopped growing in our early 20s, they didn't know the meaning of this. And then they discovered that the rate at which we make new brain cells and new connections, our neurogenic rate, is the most important biomarker for brain health of anything else. So one experiment was done by the person who discovered neurogenesis, a neuroscientist named Fred Gage, down at the Pauling Institute down in San Diego. And he increased the rate of neurogenesis and neuroplasticity in mice by 5 times. And what he discovered was that they became kind of like super mice. They had big cognitive advantages over their normal neurogenic rate peers. They were smarter, they figured things out faster, they learned things more quickly, and they were emotionally protected from stress, from anxiety, and from depression. There was robust emotional resilience there.
Fascinating.
It turns out it's the same thing with people. When we slow down the neurogenic rate, we get anxiety, we get stress, we get depression, and we get brain fog. We get cognitive complications, cognitive decline. So the book is really about how to increase our neurogenic rate and heal and strengthen the brain, right? That everybody has some degree of brain weakness or brain sluggishness, or almost everybody. Mm-hmm. So the book is a holistic approach, meaning body, heart, mind, spirit, working on all these levels to increase our brain health. Because we exist in all these levels.
Right.
physically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, and we experience them all through the brain. The brain integrates all of this into one smooth functioning.
Isn't it fascinating? So,
Mhm.
Dr. Cortright, what I'm understanding you're saying is, with the amount of toxins in the environment and in the food we eat, and I suppose really everything the modern lifestyle kind of exposes us to, we are as population and individuals maybe experiencing some symptoms of brain sluggishness, brain fog, emotional challenges even that are really more a result of the environment around us, making it harder for us to prosper in some ways. I want to, if that's the case, I think so many of us, we just think and assume that as we get older over time, we're going to become weaker, we're going to become slower. Is that an inevitable part of aging, or with what you are sharing through discoveries with your book? Are there ways to mitigate some of those effects of just aging that we think, oh, well, I'm going to be 90 years old and not remember my name? Is that an inevitable reality?
Not, definitely not. That is totally a result of lifestyle, of diet and lifestyle. More and more, it's pretty clear that Alzheimer's is a lifestyle disease. It's not inevitable. Same with dementia and cognitive decline. So there are certain cognitive capacities which actually don't even reach optimal levels until the late 50s or even 60s.
Interesting.
Certain things slow down, like reaction time slows down from our 30s. But certain things like empathy, vocabulary, certain other things actually increase well into our late 50s and 60s, which is why we want our fighter pilots to be in their 20s and 30s, but we want our politicians to be older than that. And it turns out also that you can increase your neurogenic rate in middle age at least 5 times, and in very old age, 3 to 5 times, maybe even more, because now that they've discovered so many compounds and nutrients that increase neurogenesis and neuroplasticity, that putting them all together, who knows? We don't really know what the upper limit is right now, but it seems clear that part of it is diet and what we feed it, and part of it also is how we use our brains. The emotional atmosphere we live in, the interpersonal atmosphere we create for ourselves, as well as the mental atmosphere. Right? There's measurable cognitive decline at 2 times in life for many people: when we graduate from college or when we retire. Unless when you graduate from college or when you retire, you do something that involves using your brain, using your mind. Then there is no measurable cognitive decline after that.
Fascinating. So there are things we can do. I'm sure everybody listening is now wondering, okay, you've mentioned a couple times now, there are foods and things we can do or eat or shift in our lifestyle that can help us have better neurogenesis. So what are some of those things? What would be the top 3 to 5 maybe things that any person could do to improve or restore their brain health?
Okay, good. Yeah, that's kind of the $1,000,000 question. Like, what
Yeah.
can you actually do about this?
Yeah.
So the book goes into the 4 pillars of the healthy brain diet, which is neurogenic, ketogenic or low fat, anti-inflammatory, and gut friendly. They're all important, and they all contribute to increasing the neurogenic rate. So there are about 40 different compounds that have been shown to raise BDNF, which is brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is like miracle grow for the brain. The brain just sort of takes off when those levels are high. So one of the most important is omega-3 fatty acids, fish oil. Christine Thuray at the University of London increased neurogenesis and neuroplasticity by 40% simply by adding omega-3s to the diet.
Incredible.
And they did one experiment with monkeys where they took a group of monkeys and raised them on a low omega-3 diet, and another group of monkeys they raised on a high omega-3 diet. And then they looked at their brains. The low omega-3 diet monkeys had very simple, undifferentiated brains. The high omega-3 monkeys had very complex, richly differentiated brains, almost like humans. The most important thing you can do for your brain is give it copious amounts of omega-3. And there are 3 major fatty acids in omega-3s. ALA, not so important, EPA, which is a big anti-inflammatory and helpful, and DHA, which is the fundamental building block of the brain. Almost 2/3 of our brain is fat, and of that, 1/3 to 1/2 of it is DHA. It is the fundamental building block of our brain. We need to make sure we have lots of it. So if we have high inflammatory levels, we need 2-to-1 EPA to DHA. If we have low inflammatory levels, we want a 1-to-1 EPA to DHA. And one good blood test for everybody to do when they get their yearly physical is called a high sensitivity C-reactive protein, high sensitivity CRP. And if your level is 0.5 and below for a male, or 1.0 and below for a female, you're doing great. Then you want a 1-to-1 ratio. But if your levels are higher than that, then you want this 2-to-1 ratio, because you want to bring down your inflammatory levels as soon as possible. Because inflammation it chews up the inside of our blood vessels, creating heart disease and affecting the brain, because the brain has the most blood of anything. It has something like 20% of our blood supply, but only 3% of the body's weight.
Oh, I didn't know that. Now, a quick question. I know we're going to get through the rest of the 4 points in the list. Chronic inflammation is also related to reduced, like your immune system is weakened. Is that right? I know a lot of people, we're all a lot more aware now of kind of our health and our immune system because of the pandemic going on. Is this a related issue?
Absolutely, absolutely. If our inflammatory levels are high, it means that there are these inflammatory cytokines all the time operating. It's actually working against the body. It's the body kind of attacking itself. We want to be able to mount an inflammatory response when we're sick or when we have a wound to heal, but we want to turn it off when we're not doing that. So getting those inflammatory levels down is really important. Because it just begins to degrade every system in the body, particularly the brain and the cardiovascular system, but all systems, immune system as well. That's right. There's a number of other just nutrients that are neurogenic that are helpful, like green tea. If people can do 10 to 15, the equivalent of 10 to 15 cups of green tea, has a powerful effect on the brain. But we don't have caffeine. Right. So you can a caffeine-free extract of green tea. Blueberries are good for the brain, very, very neurogenic. Luteolin, apigenin, hesperidin, these kind of bioflavonoids, really helpful. Most people need to take them as supplements because you can't get enough from the diet. And the book goes into many others that are really helpful for jump-starting this neurogenic process of the brain.
Fantastic. That's super practical. And what are the next one I think you said was ketogenic.
Ketogenic or low carb. So it turns out that about 80% of the population has some degree of insulin resistance, meaning our blood sugar levels are higher than optimal. The higher your blood sugar level, the faster your rate of cognitive decline. High blood sugar means that there is extra inflammation, extra oxidation, extra glycation, which is something that happens with aging. So another good test for people to do is called a hemoglobin A1C, which is a snapshot of your glucose levels over the last 3 months.
Interesting.
If that is over 5.0, you want to bring that down. Because every 1/10 of a point higher, even though you're not even in the pre-diabetic range, causes a more rapid increase in cognitive decline, a more rapid decline in your cognitive capabilities. So Also, having high blood sugar levels increases your inflammatory levels. So low carb or ketogenic diet's being used with Alzheimer's. It's being used with just about anything that is neurological. Parkinson's, epilepsy. The word that's being used by researchers is neuroprotective, that the brain works more efficiently with ketone bodies, with fat as fuel, rather than sugar as fuel, because sugar burns as a kind of dirty fuel, creating a lot of toxic byproducts, whereas fat for fuel burns very cleanly and more efficiently. One researcher at Harvard, Richard Beach, who recently died, found out that the mitochondria of the heart work 28% more efficiently when they use ketones for fuel rather than glucose. And since the neurons have similar mitochondria to the heart, if you could imagine your brain working 28% more efficiently on ketones, you get some sense of just that things are operating more smoothly, there's a greater equilibrium, you feel like you're operating on all cylinders. Mm-hmm. So ketogenic or low carb is helpful for most people. Then anti-inflammatory, we want to bring those inflammation levels down. This is a huge issue. We'll go into that more, but let's stop there. But there are a number of natural things you can eat, like turmeric, for example, curcumin, black cumin seed extract, tart cherry extract. There's a number of things you can just include, borage oil, as part of your diet, that bring those levels down naturally. And depression is an inflammatory process.
Tell me more. I know that. I hadn't heard that.
Yeah. So many people are now treating depression along with antidepressants with anti-inflammatories as well. Similar with anxiety. When you have high levels of inflammation, the body knows something is wrong, but it doesn't know what it is. And so it begins to feel anxious, it's like your system goes, wait a second, something is wrong here. And we begin to feel anxious. And so I think one of the reasons for this really epidemic of anxiety and depression is the standard American diet, abbreviated SAD, is highly inflammatory. You couldn't come up with a better diet to produce anxiety, depression, cognitive decline, Alzheimer's, inflammation, obesity, insulin resistance. So high carbohydrate, high sugar, high bad fat, low good fat, low fiber, high processed food. It's a recipe for all these things. So we want to eliminate the standard American diet and eat a healthy brain diet. Again, neurogenic, ketogenic or low carb, anti-inflammatory, and gut friendly. And the gut friendly, maybe we can just take a minute to focus on.
Tell us about that, sure.
So we have 40 trillion microbes, bacteria in our intestinal system. It's a whole ecosystem down there.
I think there are more of them than there are of us.
Well, they used to think there was more. They've now done a recount and found out about as many cells of our own as we have of them, about 40 trillion each.
Still amazing.
Still amazing, yeah. They produce most of the neurotransmitters in our body. They did one experiment with mice where they took mice who were genetically bred to be anxious. And they took mice that were genetically bred to be fearless. And they took the microbiome from each and they transposed them. And the anxious mice became fearless and the fearless mice became anxious.
Wow.
Pretty amazing when you think about it. It means the microbiome trumps genetics. Or what it really means is that the microbiome turns on and off the epigenetic switches involved in mood. So there are a few different probiotics that have been shown to reduce anxiety and depression scores by 50%.
Incredible.
There are
Mhm.
that are not being used in trials that have been shown to increase cognitive performance as well. And the book goes into these in
Sure.
much greater. But again, a simple thing to do is just to add some of these probiotics to your diet.
Sure.
Very simple.
Dr. Cortright, it's possible to get probiotics through your food too. You can get fermented foods, apple cider vinegar with the mother. Are those the best sources or complementary really to supplements? Is it about, quantity, quality, diversity? What would one focus on with gut health?
Good question. I think there are a few strains that are really helpful for mood and cognition, but we don't want to rely on that entirely. We want to increase the total microbial diversity in our gut. So indigenous populations have about 20,000 different strains of bacteria, which is really wonderful. In the West, with the overuse of antibiotics, the overuse of pesticides, things like that, most people have 10,000 strains or less.
Wow.
Since 80% of our immune system is in our gut, we want as diverse a microbiome as we can get. So when you take a probiotic, you're only taking 1 or 2 or maybe 5 or 10 strains.
Mm.
But if you go out into nature and you just breathe, or you go into the ocean and you just take you swallow some water.
Always happens.
Or when you're gardening, you don't clean yourself off immediately. You let that dirt be there and let it colonize your skin, and it works its way in. So when you're out in nature, you get hundreds of new bacterial strains. And that's what we want to do. We want to increase the number of strains by hundreds, by thousands, really. Plantarum, Lactobacillus plantarum, is one bacterial strain that tends to increase other bacterial strains. And eating a fiber-rich diet also has a big impact on increasing by hundreds and hundreds the number of bacterial strains in the gut. Again, most people eat too little fiber. Simply increasing your fiber is a way to increase the healing of your gut.
Would the best source of that fiber be through, produce, fresh produce, or what are some of the sources?
Yeah, the best is vegetables.
Yeah.
Non-carby vegetables, ideally.
Okay.
It's such a carb-focused culture. Most people get most of their vitamin C from French fries. Can you believe that?
No, I didn't. I didn't even know they had an ounce of vitamin C in them. That's wild.
Much. Obviously, there's oranges and there's other things that are packed with it.
Yeah.
So potatoes are not a great source of fiber. We want to have non-carb of fiber. Asparagus, bok choy, broccoli, cauliflower, salads, tomatoes, avocados are great.
Legumes, do they count as well for fiber?
Legumes are good for fiber. It all depends on what your degree of insulin sensitivity is, because those are also pretty high in carbs. Mm-hmm. So if you're on a strict ketogenic diet, you probably wouldn't want to do too many legumes. But if you're simply on a low carb diet, then some legumes are just fine. Yeah, okay. It all depends on what your hemoglobin A1C is.
Yeah, interesting. Okay. Well, that's exciting. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more, and I know a little bit about this myself, but I'd rather everyone hears it from you because you're the authority. Tell us more about how the link between gut health and mental health. And you were mentioning that 80% of our immune system is in our gut, but I understand that a lot of the production of our feelings and emotions actually have a link to what's going on in our gut as well.
Yeah, it's huge. It's sometimes referred to as our second brain. Mm. The vagus nerve is down there. The vagus nerve has a big impact on how we feel. And the microbes down there stimulate or don't the vagus nerve. They also produce, depending on the neurotransmitter, 80 to 90% of our neurotransmitters. So that gut feeling that we have is really a gut feeling. And there's some evidence to show that even what we eat is determined, or what we want to eat is determined by our microbiome.
Yeah.
Certain microbial strains cause us to crave things like sugar. So it kind of raises a very interesting question of free will.
Yeah.
Like, who's in charge here, right? We've got this whole 40 trillion alien species living here,
Yeah.
but like our consciousness is influenced by that. And so we want to have a good relationship with our microbial neighbors here.
Sure.
And so that's another reason to eat fiber, because they thrive on fiber. So it's sort of like what the pediatrician tells the pregnant woman, you're not just eating for one. So here you're eating for 40 trillion.
Boy, portion control for 40 trillion. I know what you mean. You have to give the good microbiome the kind of nutrients or foods that they need so that they can continue to colonize and grow, and the less helpful microbiome don't have anything to eat, starving them out.
That's right. That's right. The less helpful ones thrive on sugar, for example.
Yeah, sometimes I think they yell at me from the inside out. It's very interesting though, because I think understanding what you're saying in more depth, and I'm sure reading through your book, we could all get a lot more in depth on this issue. Becoming aware of that could really help us change our behaviors and our attitudes, and just becoming more aware of, hey, this craving, or hey, if I'm feeling a little bit of brain fog, or I'm a little bit depressed and there doesn't seem, or anxious, there doesn't seem to be a real issue around me causing it. Looking inside to what's going on through our diet, through our lifestyle, that could be affecting our brain's kind of predisposition in a way, if that's the right word, towards these issues, would be a really powerful kind of perspective to have, I think, to be able to do something about it.
That's right. That's right. Because it's not just a matter of healing and strengthening the brain, but really getting it to be optimally functioning. And when the brain is really at peak performance, then we have this kind of vitality, this sense of just, it feels good to be alive. There's this intrinsic feeling of it just feels good. And we can hardly wait to get out of bed in the morning and just meet the day and engage with the world. Right? Like the brain wants to engage the world on every level, again, physically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually. And that kind of optimal engagement increases the neurogenic rate, but also it just feels good, because then the brain's capacities come forth. We actualize the potentials that are there, right? We want this kind of optimal challenge, or optimal, really optimal stress.
Sure.
People talk about stress as something that's bad. But if we have too little stress, like, too little stress with muscles, and the muscles atrophy. It's the same with the brain, or the same with the self. Too much stress, and it's too much. Too little stress, and it's not enough. The brain has an optimal stress, which is basically challenge. The brain needs to be challenged. The self needs to be challenged. And when we are optimally challenged, then unknown possibilities emerge from the self. We begin to really bring forth this great potential that we have inside when we are met with, again, at every level. Emotionally, if we're in a loving environment, that brings forth the best in us. If we're in a stressful, scary environment, or an angry environment, that shuts down the neurogenic rate. That actually begins to shrivel the brain. Too much stress actually shrinks the brain. Actually, not only shuts down the neurogenic process, but kills brain cells. So we want to have a brain that is optimally functioning, and that just, it feels good to be alive. Yeah.
That's incredible. There's a movie that was made years ago, and I can't recall the name of it, which is fine, but there was a pill that one would take, and boom, you would get this optimal brain level immediately. What I like about what you're saying, and I think this goes very well with the way I try to live my life, as well as raise my daughter. It's not a magic pill. You're going to have this incredible brain functioning. It's actually so much better than that. It's already in us. We just have to take away everything that's impeding our access to it. And through your book,
That,
yeah, we get a lot of clues about what are those things we need to just throw off in our lifestyle, in our surroundings, from all this, the holistic perspective in order to access that optimum brain health. So I think that's
yeah,
super encouraging because it's within all of us. We just have to take some steps to access it, really.
yeah, that's well said. There is no magic pill. It
Yeah.
is we have to eat well, we have to live well, we have to use our brains well, we have to use our spirits well. That's right. It's at every level. And when that happens, the brain thrives, it flourishes. Yes.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. Well, Dr. Cortright, I don't want to take up a whole lot more of your time. I know you're a busy man. Do you have any last things you'd like to share before we go?
No, I'm sort of left with what Dickens said. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. And I think it's true for the brain. It's never been a worse time for the brain. There's never been more of an onslaught of neurotoxins. But at the same time, it's never been a better time for the brain. We've never known more about how to increase the neurogenic rate and how to really flourish. So I think when we begin to really take responsibility for our brain and for our emotional, mental, spiritual health, then we really can move into where living feels really good.
Yeah. Well, that's so encouraging. I really, really, again, appreciate so much that you've taken the time to speak with me, and I can't wait to share this message with our audience and community. I think it's so, so important and so encouraging for us to know what we can do to get to that great feeling. And if people want to know more about you, how can they find you? What's the best way for them to connect with you?
Well, easiest probably is just to buy the book on Amazon, Holistic Healing for Anxiety, Depression, and Cognitive Decline. I also have a website, brantcortright.com.
Sounds good. Hopefully they can get on your mailing list and hear more from you. I'm sure you send out some great content and information to help them keep moving forward. Dr. Cortright, thank you again. A pleasure to see you as always, and we'll look forward to connecting again soon.
It was a pleasure. Yeah, thank you, Jamie.
Take care. Bye.